I have, for Indian psychology, another apprehension. I'm sure that in the end it will be overcome, but I think at this juncture it is something that we should pay attention to. It will not last, but for the time being it is something to be aware of. Psychology is a very strange science because it deals with ourselves. So there is a problem of recursion and self-reflection in it. Dr. Bhatt was talking, and Professor Jha in a different way. They were talking about the problem of knowledge. And the difficulty there is that when we are talking about it, we are already using knowledge. And so, when we do psychology, we try to find out how the human mind knows things. But that the very process of being busy with it is itself based on certain notions of science, certain notions of knowledge, certain notions of psychology. So what my apprehension is that all of us have had a solidly westernized, materialistic, largely positivistic education behind us. And when we approach Indian psychology, we do it from that framework. It is almost impossible for us to avoid. The way we talk, the way we think, is all based, it is all in English for one thing. And it is based on, has a long tradition in the European tradition of thinking. And that has very serious difficulties, especially with the Indian tradition. So far, most research in, or one should really say about Indian psychology so far, has been using Western scientific methods to approach phenomena that actually are way beyond the scope of what Western science can deal with. The results of yoga are not supposed to be to reduce tension, to reduce stress, lower hypertension, and things like that. These are side effects. The real thing is something that goes beyond these. And if we don't make these a very serious and central aspect of our research, then we completely miss the point. Now, how do we go about that? Science works well within its own fixed framework. Then people can nicely plot on, and there are no difficult questions asked. But in this case, if we want to introduce the Indian tradition in science, we have a very serious problem. Because the basic framework on which the Indian tradition is based is far wider than that of science. So if we try to fit the Indian into what we can for short call the Western, something goes wrong. Something has to be cut, something is deformed. While the other way, it works perfectly fine. The basic framework that puts consciousness at the center of the universe and at the beginning of everything that is, makes it fairly easy to put matter as a certain form of manifestation in that wider framework. But you cannot get to an understanding of Brahman from a materialistic framework. It doesn't fit anywhere. Science recently has, after a long neglect, discovered that it cannot deal very well with consciousness. The Journal of Consciousness Studies has once in a while only an article that actually deals with consciousness. Most of the articles actually deal with the physical substrate of consciousness, or the social forms that consciousness can take. But it does not deal with consciousness itself, because our present science has no way of approaching consciousness. The reason for that is that science so far has tried systematically to be objective. Now, objectivity is fine when we want to study objects. But psychology does not deal with objects. Psychology deals with subjects. And when we treat human beings as objects, things go very seriously astray. There are very serious ontological problems, epistemological problems, ethical problems that are a result of it. I think we can blame most of the problems that we have with modern education on the bad psychology of the beginning of the 19th century. When psychology tried to develop on the basis of studies with rats, naturally you get an educational psychology after that that treats people like that, and then you get a society like that. So if we want to get out of this whole thing, then we have to develop a subjective science. Interestingly, Professor Butt in the morning started with something which is, I think, for a philosopher very special. Started by asking psychologists to solve some of the philosophical problems that have been there for thousands of years. And yesterday, Dr. Sudarshan also said that psychologists should focus primarily on the experience, that experience stands central, and that we should take experience serious. Now, how to do this? How to make a really serious science, a really serious study, rigorous, detailed, reliable, valid, of subjective experience. Not by trying to objectify, but by being subjectively, by being a subject in a reliable, true fashion. My proposition is that the whole secret lies in accepting that we as people are the main instrument of psychological investigation, and that the psychologist should accept that the quality of his work depends on his own consciousness and on his own inner instrument, and that the psychological training and psychological research should be based on that basic idea. What we can know about ourselves, and in the end about the world, depends on the quality of our own inner instrument. And it is this that we have to develop. And it is for this that the Indian tradition has provided this enormous number of tools in the form of intellectual concepts, in the form of yogic techniques, in the form of stories, in the form of parables. There is an enormous rich tradition of trying to improve our own instrument of knowing. And I think it is this that modern psychology, whether Indian or Western or whatever it may be, has to borrow or to lend and make use of for the development of psychology. Because research in psychology has to be primarily a research inward. It has to be a study of our own consciousness. And then we find, like the Indian tradition has always found, that if you look inside, in your own consciousness, it is there where the universe is. And you find other people also. It is not that the world disappears. There's no solipsism in it. I always give, at the end of the year, I ask my students to evaluate what happened during the year. And this student was actually a literary student who took psychology as an elective. He said that he came to the class because he wanted to understand others. He wanted to understand why people behave the way they do, which is a standard definition actually of modern psychology. And then he realized that I was not teaching it. I was encouraging students to look at themselves, to try to study their own consciousness. So in the beginning, he was just kind of hanging on and hoping that things would improve. But then he realized that he himself was quite more mysterious and quite stranger and quite more interesting than he had ever thought. He had not taken himself, never questioned himself in that sense. But he got quite fascinated by how it all worked. So he slowly forgot about the whole idea of understanding other people. But then by the end of the year, he said he sometimes caught himself in the act of smiling when he saw other people doing certain things. Because he thought in himself, hey, I know why that person does that. Because I've been there. I know what it is. Because he knew himself, he could understand others. And I think that's basically the way a new psychology could work. There's even some Western research actually that shows that people can understand better other people who are like themselves. And I think in more detail you know yourself, you realize that you have actually all the difficulties, all the oddities, all the specialties of anybody. It is just that you have to know yourself in very great detail, that you can see all those different aspects that we share in different degrees between us. The details of this can be worked out. The principle, I think, is very simple. We have to learn, as one of the other speakers said, to be more and more honest, to be more and more sincere and simple, and to know exactly where the inaccuracies and the deformations in our own nature are. And just very technically, severely, the Indian tradition has basically developed two major techniques for this. One is that of detachment, of standing back, going to the inner consciousness, going more to the self, the Atman, the pure consciousness Professor Bhatt described and wanted or wanted not to include in standard epistemology. And the other is to improve and perfect the outer nature. Both elements are necessary. The big question is, and I don't have a full answer to that, how exactly to incorporate this in research? If you look at psychological research, then it tries to be empirical. And because human nature is too complex, like in medicine, it uses large statistics and then tries to average things out. Obviously, that's not a very good way of finding out how things work. In most other sciences, that's not done. There are actually very different types of research. And at least some aspects of psychology could much better be compared, say, to astronomy. Astronomy doesn't do any experimentation. It makes better and better instruments to watch the universe, makes better and better mathematical models. And in that way, progresses with its knowledge. If I look at the sky and see something, it will not get into science. You need for that very refined instrumentation. So that is a science with which at least some of the processes of psychological research could perhaps well be compared with. There's another type of research, that's the more technical research. If the Nokia company brings out a new, or wants to bring out a new cell phone, it doesn't need to do a statistical study to find out whether its new techniques work. They either work or they don't work. They have to do the thing. They cannot survive without research. If they don't do research, after 3 years they're gone. But they don't need the kind of verification, counter-verification, all the tricks that present psychology does. They just do a job. That is another aspect of research, action research one could call it, that could play a major role in psychology. You do change your nature. You don't need to prove it. It works or it doesn't work, but you do it. And the action of the change is itself the process of research. I think that is a valid form of research. The question how to share it with others is a difficult problem, but it is a separate problem. It is not a problem of the research as such. There may be other paradigms of research, other basic methods than action research and then observation research than the two I've mentioned. An important one is literature research. And there the problems come in that Vladimir mentioned. We can use our modern mind to do literature search in the Indian tradition, and then we can nicely learn how to dribble the words. But that's not going to do the trick. At least at the time of the Vedas, the word had still magic. The word was a power. So the word could create. And the word, on the other hand, was meant to take people back to the higher realities that they refer to. And so when we study these scriptures, we should also not study them in a limiting, concept-based manner. We can use concepts, but we should be clear that we use them and that we are not focus on our attention on finding the experiential realities and the higher forms of consciousness that stand behind them. There are many open questions in this, but one thing that we really should avoid is to limit Indian psychology by remaining too much stuck in the Western frameworks that we used to start with. The Indian framework is far wider, and the whole consciousness on which it is based is far deeper than the consciousness of Western science and the consciousness in which most of us live all the time. So it is a knowledge that is transformative, and we should be, as much as we can, open to that. And then I think Indian psychology will really contribute a tremendous deal to the development of humanity. It is indeed true that the introspection was rejected. Historically, it is very interesting, because what was the main issue that made people doubt about introspection? That was that one major school of introspection, if I'm informed well, was thinking that you could have thought without images, and the other school was claiming that thought was always in images. If you think a little about it, then that is not too different from the problem that confronted science in exactly the same period with the particle wave issue. It is also, see, Nama and Rupa are somewhat similar to the problem of particle and wave. It's not exactly identical, but there is a similar discongruity. Interestingly, the hard sciences and physics, and that goes very much to his credit, were not in the least perturbed. They were perturbed, but they stuck to their guts. I mean, they'd found that reality was not as simple, that it could be either this or that, but somewhere in between, or neither this nor that, whatever, but not exactly the way we thought the world would. But the psychologists immediately withdrew and decided, okay, this is not going to work, so forget about introspection. Which was weird, positively weird. The other reason is that the introspection they used was not the same as the self-observation that is the basis of yoga. Not at all. If people just start, it is a mistake that many beginning meditators make. If you just start meditating, you so-called watch your thoughts. What you actually do, you think about your thoughts. So instead of just having a thought, you say, I am having a thought. One part of your mind commenting on another part of the mind. It only gets more noisy inside. But that's not in the least what meditation is supposed to be about. There the element of sakshi comes in. So you don't introspect, you don't look inside, but you stand apart and become the witness. Then that whole problem of recursion, the whole problem of intervention in the processes, of naming things before they've actually fully occurred, all that doesn't occur anymore. So there's simply, I think, a completely wrong technology of self-observation. So I think these two issues together, I think point the direction of the solution.
कीजिए मैं प्रभु दास तुम्हारा